Hey guys, welcome back. So in this lesson, we're going to be setting up our environment so we can get into coding with MAUI. Now, MAUI at the time of this recording is in preview, which means that we need Visual Studio 2022 preview version. So you may already have Visual Studio 2022 installed. You're going to need the preview. If not, then no problem. We're going to go through the basic steps or the most needed steps together. So let's just start off by going to visualstudio.microsoft.com, and then when you're on that page, you need to go to latest preview and then download the preview. So this will download that installer to your computer. And when that launches, you're going to want to make sure that you're getting the preview. So if you go over to the available section, you're going to see 2017, 2022, 2019. So you want to make sure that you're getting the one that is marked as preview, right? So we can go ahead and get the community preview edition. So I don't have it listed here. That's because I already have it installed. So you can go ahead and launch the installer. And what will happen is that it will bring up this window where it asks you which workloads do you want. So you can look at the workloads I have, but the ones that are essential for this course are ASP.NET and web development, because we will be building an API. So we do need the web workload, and you definitely need the MAUI workload. Now, I'm just going to be plain. Given that this is preview, I'm sure that these are kinks that will be worked out as the development team gets better and better at releasing these workloads and these development packs. But as it stands, I had to select the .NET Multi-Platform App UI development, which is MAUI, right? I had to get the desktop development, and I also had to get the UWP, right? Now, after selecting all of those, I still went over to individual components and I searched for Android, and I made sure that I had all of these things ticked, right? So some of them would have been ticked by virtue of you choosing the workloads, and some might not have been. So I made sure that I had the Google Android emulator ticked and the C++ Android development tools. I had to do all of that. Right. So hopefully by the time you're doing this course, you might not need to go through all of that, or maybe the workload will select everything that it should select. But I'm just showing you these things so that you can have the path of least resistance when going through this exercise. Now, once you have all of those things selected, the workload, the installation size will probably be closer to about 40 gigabytes. So you can go ahead and install. Hopefully you have enough space. I'm confident that you do, but once you go ahead and install and you're finished, then you can continue this video. Now, once that is installed, you can go ahead and launch Visual Studio 2022. Now, what we're going to do is create a new project. And when that comes up, we're going to want a .NET MAUI app. Now, if you don't have it to the left like I do, that's because I recently created one. You can always search and it will filter that list for you. So you go ahead and select .NET MAUI app, and then you're going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this one My First MAUI App, right? So you can go ahead and name it that. And this is not going to be the project that we're going to be developing with. This is just a project so we can set up our environment and get used to what MAUI looks like. All right, so when Visual Studio launches, then we have the main page.xaml file loaded for us. Now, there are a few things that I want us to take note of here. Once again, this is still in preview, so there are going to be some kinks that I'm going to walk you through. And hopefully you'll have the same experience I'm having and you won't have any attrition completing these tasks. So the first thing that I want us to be present of is the fact that this is a XAML file, which is really a dialect of XML. So you can see here at the top is letting you know that it is indeed an XML file. And this is the main page. So this is the sample page that we get with this sample, with this project template pretty much. And if you just read it, you can see that it looks a little like HTML because once again, both are based on XML. And you'll see that each tag kind of makes sense. It's really just standard English. So here we see that we have a tag that says image, and we have some attributes for that image tag. We have a label tag that has some attributes and another label and a button. right? Now, for every XAML page, which would really be like a literal page in your app that you will be creating, you're going to have a code behind file. So we have mainpage.xaml, and then we have mainpage.xaml.cs. So in that CS file, one, it is being initialized. So if you've ever worked with WPF or Windows Forms, then that kind of code would kind of look familiar to you, right? So we have our partial class main page, and it's inheriting from another class called content page, and it has a global variable, or global to the class at least. We have our constructor, which is initializing all the components, and this is just a method that runs in the back, initializing all the controls that will be used throughout the application or throughout this particular control, right? And then we have a method here that is saying on counter clicked. Now, this is what we call an event. So on counter clicked is an event or a method that will be called each time the button gets clicked. So we have the button control here. Let me zoom in a bit to make sure that we can see. So we have our button control. We give it a name. So that's one of the attributes, right? So this name attribute allows us to reference it from the code behind. So if we wanted to change something about the button or the label or anything that we define here, we make sure we give it a name. Then we have the text that the button has, and then we have semantic properties dot hint, and then it tells us that, okay, it counts the number of times you click, and then clicked, that would be our click event, and then it says when it is clicked, call this method. So when it clicked, call on counter clicked. What is on counter clicked? Well, that is the method that we have here. So this method takes information about who called the event and what kind of event triggered it. So here we'll be able to know that the button called the event and it was triggered by a click event. And then it does an operation where it increments the count that was previously defined. And then it sets the text based on whether the count is equivalent to 1 or greater than 1. And then it sends a message to the semantic screen reader and says, announce the counter button text. Right? So in other words, we change. So here's counter BTN. I said button, but it's counter BTN. What is counter BTN? That's the name that we gave to the button. So here we're saying when clicked, get the button, change its text to be whatever I want it to be, and then announce to our screen that the text of the button has changed. Right? So that semantic screen reader is going to be our little bridge between our code behind and what we see visibly on the app, right? So that's what that is for. Now, other files include the program.cs. So this is the bootstrapper. So with most, if not all C# programs, they all have a program.cs. Whether it's WinForms, WPF, or ASP.NET, it's going to have some form of program.cs with a main method that is going to run initially. So this would represent that kind of file in a MAUI app. And then it's going to basically create the MAUI app. It starts up a builder, and then it says use app, and we'll see what app is. So app.xaml is right here. So it's saying use that, configure fonts, and then build. All right. So what is app? What does app do? So let's jump over to app. App.xaml is one of those base files. So you don't want to delete these files. These files are very essential. Essentially, we're just declaring some namespaces. It knows what its class is. So it's .app. So that's why we're able to call it, once again in the code, app, right? And then it defines some application resources, some styles and colors, etc. And that is what our app.xaml file is for. We also have the app shell. The app shell, once again, defines some namespaces, and then it says the content, the home page is supposed to be main page. So we're sending it to main page as soon as upload. So if you wanted to create a different home page, you'd have to make sure that you tell it that it's no longer main page, it's now the page that I have created, or the XAML control that I created. All right. Other folders, we have resources. So what happens let me go to platforms first. So what happens with Xamarin, because MAUI is basically a replacement for Xamarin, and Xamarin was a pioneer in cross app platform development, where it gave you the ability to have one project with one code base being just C sharp, to service multiple mobile interfaces and mobile systems. Now, what happens is that MAUI, instead of requiring you to create a different project per, because with Xamarin, I would have to have a project for the Android, I would have to have a project for iOS, etc., etc. Instead of doing project, it gives us one project, and for whatever unique resources we need for that particular mobile OS, we have a folder. So instead of multiple projects, we have one project with multiple folders that are capable of storing the specific instructions and resources and whatever are required for that particular OS. So we see here that we have the Android folder, we have the iOS folder, we have Tizen, which I think is Samsung, we have Mac Catalyst, and we have Windows, right? So one code base to rule them all, pretty much. So that's what we see in the platforms folder. And then in resources, now we can have all the resources we need, because what would happen is that with Xamarin, you might end up putting an icon in the Android folder or project and forgetting to put it inside of the iOS one. Here we have one folder where we can put everything that we need, so that all of our apps can look uniformed from this one code base. Now you see here that I have this little warning icon for dependencies, and you'll see that I have some dependencies missing and some stuff. If I do a build right now, I'm going to get a bunch of errors. Now I scoured the internet. So once again, this is preview. So I'm sure once it is released fully, I would have to re-record this lesson and not have to put in what I'm about to share. But for now, while you're doing it in preview, what you want to do is go to the solution file, open it in terminal, and then you want to type this in. .NET, I put a space in there, so that's no space. So .NET new global JSON, and then dash SDK dash version, and then you're going to put in 6.0.300-preview. So like I said, and make sure you put in those exact numbers, right? So like I said, this is still in preview. So this is just a workaround to make sure that all the SDKs know which version they should be on, because once you're using the preview of Visual Studio, at this point, as at the time of this recording, it's defaulting to .NET 7, which is not yet outfitted and qualified for MAUI apps, right? So just make sure you put this in as you see me with it here, and then you can press enter. And what that will do is create a global.json file at the root or at the solution level, right? So once we do that, we can do a Control Shift and B and allow it to rebuild itself. And once that is finished building, then you'll notice that that warning sign is no longer there, and all of our dependencies are now, well, they're no longer warning you. So that's a good sign, right? So let us jump over to actually seeing what this app looks like when it is running. So up top here at our play button, I'm going to hit the caret, and then I'm going to choose that I want to use the... All right, I paused just now because I didn't see what I was expecting to see. So once again, I'm walking you through every single step that I need you to be aware of. If you only see Windows machine when you drop down this caret and you're not seeing as many options as I'm seeing, restart your Visual Studio. So close Visual Studio, relaunch the project, and when you do, chances are you're going to see what I'm seeing, right? We also have access to Android emulators. So what happens is that I had a few instances of the emulator device running already. So when you go to Tools, you go to Android, and then you can go to the Device Manager. And then once that launches, it will show you all of the emulators that you probably have running. So I had 3 running. right? I stopped this one and I removed the other two, which were launched from my previous experiments with MAUI. So between all of those actions, you should be able to get to this point where you're seeing all of these options, right? So I'm going to go down to the Android emulator and I'm going to select the Android emulator. And then I'm going to hit the play button because I want to see what this looks like on Android. All right, so here is our mobile app. And if you look at it look at it with the code, you'll be able to map back each element, right? So here's our image, the .NET bot.png. There we go. We have the label, hello world. We have the one that says welcome. And then we have our button that says click me. So when I click me, I set a breakpoint on the click event and you see it's hitting that click event. So count is equal to 0. On the first click, we're going to say click is 1 time, and then it's going to declare or announce rather to the semantic screen reader to update. So I'm just going to hit F5 so it continues, and you see here it says clicked 1 time. But then if I click it again, it's going to say, okay, clicked 2 times. F5, and there we go, clicked 2 times. So that's pretty much how a MAUI app looks out of the box. That's how it works. Yes, the setup might be a pain, but hopefully you get through this exercise. If not, feel free to use that Q&A section and let me know. All right, guys, so let's continue our discovery of MAUI now that we have it up and running and we're familiar with the different moving parts. So let us try creating a new page. So I'm going to right click on the project, go to add a new item, and then I'm going to want from the .NET MAUI section a new content page, right? And then let's call this one test page. Nice and simple. So what that gives us is a new C# class that allows us to define what we want on the page. So this is not a XAML page, right? So there are 2 ways to create content on a page or create pages. One is with the XAML file with supporting C# code, and we can actually have the C# generate the parts that we're putting on the page. So for example's sake, I'm going to take this test page and I'm going to make it the startup page. So jumping over to app.xaml, I'm going to say that I want, I'm sorry, not app.xaml, app shell.xaml. I'm going to tell it that I want it to route to the test page. So test page instead of main page. So let's take a look at what we get with that. And that's what we get. We get a simple label with the text, welcome to .NET MAUI. And that's exactly what we have on the app, right? So you can see that our C# class is working. So let us build out on this a bit more. So what we have essentially would be one, the content object here that represents the view content, right? And then we're saying that we want a new stack layout with children. So this is a layout, and there are different kinds of layouts that you can do. So if you were to just type in the word layout, well, they're kind of jumbled here, but you have absolute layout, you have carousel type, compressed layout, flex layout. There are a number of layout options. So this default option that we got was a stack layout, and then we could add the children and we could have a new label. And then let us do an exercise where we're going to put in some other elements. So let us start by erasing everything inside of this class, or this constructor rather. So you can see here that everything starts with a constructor. Yes, it's a class, but the constructor is where the action or the initialization will occur, right? So what we're going to do is build out something similar to what we have on the main page, but we're only going to be using code. So let us start off with initializing our counter to 0. And then I'm going to have a static label that I'm going to call it, let's say, counter label. It's always good practice, even in whether when forms or when we're doing visual programming, to always give our controls names and have either a prefix or a postfix that kind of indicates what kind of control it is. So my general thing would be that I would say like LBL and then the name, right? So LBL is short for label. That's my own. So you can develop your own technique if you want, but it's generally good practice because later on when the code base grows, it's easier to identify when you want a label versus a text box versus a button, etc. Right? So, oh well, first of all, these should be outside of the constructor. Apologies. So count and label outside of the constructor. And then inside of the constructor, we can define a new view type. So I'm going to say scroll view. So I'll just I'll just say var scroll view is equal to a new scroll view, right? And then I'm going to say my stack layout is equal to a new stack layout. There we go. Then I can say the scroll view. So scroll view, I want your content to be the stack layout. So right there, I'm saying create a scroll view inside this page, and then inside of create a scroll view, create a stack layout, and then place that stack layout inside of the scroll view. So even though scroll view might be self-explanatory, I'm still going to explain that it's the control that allows you to scroll up and down on the mobile app, right? So if the content is too much, we just put it in a scroll view, and that handles the scrolling for the overflow of the content. So inside of the label for the counter, I'm going to say that it is equal to a new label, which I'm going to initialize with a few values. So here I can set those dimensions or those attributes. So whatever you would have put in the XAML, and we're going to do an exercise where we go through the XAML, right? So I'm going to say count, and I'm going to put 0. So we start off with count being 0, right? We can set the font size and any other attributes that we want, the family, etc. So I'm going to set this to 22. What else do we want? We probably want, all right, the font attributes. Let's see what we have here. So font attributes dot, so that's an enum, and we can put it to bold, we can put it to italic, we can put it to a number of things, right? Well, really bold and italic at this point. And then we have the horizontal options. Do we want it center? Do we want it to the left, to the right, etc.? So I'm going to say layout options, place that text center. So now that I've built this control, and here you have Visual Studio guiding me along, right? They're suggesting that you add it to the stack layout, all right? So I can just press tab, let it do that. So I've built out my control, and I'm saying stack layout to your children, add this control, all right? Let us create a button. So I can say var btn counter, right, is equal to a new button. And this new button, I want it to have the text that says click to count. And then we also have, let us say, the horizontal option that makes it center also. So I'll just use this once again. And then after we have that button, we can also add it to the layout, right? So I'm just going to copy and paste and change what I know I need to change. Obviously, the children will be generic, and all of these controls are of a standard type that can be added as children. Now, after all of this, we can say this dot content is equal to whatever is in the whatever is in the scroll view. All right. So this dot content is equal to the scroll view. So let's review that very quickly. We created a scroll view, we created a stack layout, we added the stack layout to the scroll view, and then we populated the stack layout with different controls. And then at the end of everything, we're saying that the content, and this here represents the test page, right? So this is just, if you're familiar with C#, you would understand what this is, right? So this represents our test page. I'm saying test page, your content is equal to whatever is in the scroll view. Now let us take a look at what we get from this. And I'll just run without debugging. All right, so we have our app here and we have our label with font size 22. It says count 0, and we have our button that says click to count. Now, when we click, nothing is happening. Why is nothing happening? Well, we didn't tell the button that it should be doing anything when it's clicked. So what do we need to add now? We need to add what we call our, if you said click event, then you are absolutely right. So what I'm going to do here is say btn counter dot click or clicked, and then I'll say plus equals on clicked, right? Or on clicked event. Now what this is doing is saying tie the click event to this method, which of course we're going to have to define, right? So underneath our constructor, which was bootstrapping and creating all of our controls, we now have our private void method, and I call it on clicked event. And then our events typically take the object sender as well as a type called event args, and we just call that E most times. And then we have our method. So inside of our method, I'm going to say count, I want you to increment. So count plus plus. And then I would say LBL counter, your text is equal to, and then I can get creative with this message. So clicked or click count, and then I can just put in my count. And then, like we saw from the previous one, we have to say semantic screen reader dot announce that the LBL counter dot text has changed. And that's really it, right? So after doing all of that, if you're running a fast enough machine and you can keep the emulator open, you can actually hit the hot reload, which will kind of rebuild your application for you. But that usually works with the XAML changes. So what I'm going to do is rerun the application, and let us do that and wait a bit. And now when I click, you see that it is working. So our click event is working. And right there, we created our very first MAUI page. All right, so now that we've seen how to create a new page and controls using C# code, let us recreate that using XAML code. All right, so we'll go over to our project, create, add a new item, and then this time we're going to go with the MAUI content page. So notice the first one was C#, and this one is XAML, right? So we're going to select that one, and I just left the default name as we're still in the exploring state. So you see we get the stack layout and we get a default label. So let us start modifying this a bit, right? So our label last time, it said, and I'm just going to be flipping between the C# and the XAML just so I can copy and paste and go a bit more quickly. So the text here says count 0. We do get to set the vertical option, so that means it's center vertically, and then we set the horizontal to be center also. But other elements, we need it to have the name, right? So we gave it the name LBL counter. So I'm going to say x:\name is equal to LBL counter. So that way we know how to refer or reference it from the code behind. We also probably want to give it a font size. And you see all the attributes that I could set in the C#, I can actually set right here in the XAML, right? You might find this view a bit more intuitive, but that's really up to you. I'm just showing you your options. So font attributes bold, right? So that's our label. Then we have our button. So open up a new button tag. And I like to just open and close at the same time and then fill out all the attributes, right? So the text here said, let me just jump over, click to count, right? Click to count. And what else did we have? We had the click event. So on whenever it is clicked, we want to, well, here they're saying you can create a new event handler. I'll just click that. It generated one for me. So we'll look at what got generated for us in a few. We can give it the same center and vertical, horizontal and vertical centering attributes. And I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. So now let's jump over to our code behind. So the code behind file is usually going to be nested underneath the XAML file, right? And if you look at it, it will say partial, and it has the same name as the XAML file. So partial in C# just means that I have multiple classes, and each code file is just like an instance of that class, or a part of the definition of that class. So this is part of the definition in the XAML file, and the C# file is part of the definition. And that one inherits from content page. Now I've already added the private field for the count. We have our constructor, and then we have this method called initialize component. So remember that previously in test page, we would have defined everything that would have been on the visible part of our page inside of our constructor. Well, initialize component does exactly that, except it's auto-generated alongside what we're doing in the XAML file. So if you look at it, you'll see that you'll see the control names and types accordingly. So anything that you're going to be doing inside the constructor, I would advise that you do it before or after initialize component, but don't modify that line. Now we have our click event that was generated for us. And what I'm going to do is just reuse the same click event code from the previous page rather, so that we have the same behavior, right? Now to test this out, I'm going to jump over to the app shell, and I'm going to say not test page, but new page 1, right? So let us make new page 1 our first page and test this out. So when this loads, we get a very similar layout. We can see at the top here that it is new page 1, and when we click, we get the same behavior. So at this point, you now know 2 ways to create a page inside of your MAUI app. You can either use the C# code and code out all of your elements as you want them, or you can mix it where you have the XAML as well as the code behind. All right, guys, so in this lesson, we're going to be focusing on layouts, right? So let us start off by creating a new content page. I've already done that, but you can right click, go to add new item, and then we want a new content page. I called it layout example, so you can go ahead and do that. And while we're at it, let's just let the app shell know that layout example is our new home page, right? So in the layout example, we have our stack layout, and we've already seen the stack layout. We have other layouts. We have vertical stack layout, right? How's that one for size? Now, from our layout, we can actually set like margins and paddings. And if you're familiar with HTML, then you know that the margin means that wherever the element is, it's going to make that many spaces between itself and the nearest element in whatever direction we specified. Whereas the padding is the thickness, how thick we want the element itself to be. And that, well, the directional constraint also applies there, just like with the margin. So with the definition of the layout, we can actually say that we want padding. And what if I set this to 30 in all directions, right? So we just comma separate, right? And I'm actually going to use different values so we can visibly at least kind of see where those padding values are being applied, right? So I'm sure that we're going to see some weird sizing, but we can always go back and change that. We can also set the margin if we want. So I'm just showing you what your options are, right? So that's the vertical stack layout. The vertical stack layout means that it's going to stack everything from top to bottom, one on top of the other going down, right? So the next very popular one would be a grid. Now, a grid generally gives us something like a table layout, which can be very useful when we want controls beside each other, etc. So if we want that, we could actually inside of the stack layout, define a grid. So we can just open up a grid, open and close, and then inside the grid we can make our definitions. But before we make our definitions, we would want to do column definitions inside of this grid. Now, column definitions allow us to specify how big each column should be, and based on what we specify, that's the number of columns that we'll get. So you would probably see something like auto. Auto means whatever size the control is when it goes in, that's how big this column should be. We can also use a hard value and say, well, make this column exactly that many spaces. And then, like I said, as many as we put in, that's how many columns we get. So right now I've defined 3 different columns. 2 of them are auto. 1 is a fixed value of 30, right? Now inside of these columns, I can define different controls, right? So let us say I wanted a button inside of column 1, and button is a self-closing tag. And what do I want inside this button? First of all, I want it to be in the grid column. So I can say column over here, and I can say you should be in the first grid column. So it starts counting at 0. So this would be 0, 1, 2, right? So by saying grid position 0, or let me actually type it out here, grid dot column is equal to 0. That means I want in the very first column. And let's say I wanted the text to be test button, and width, let's say width request is 100, and if we wanted a click event, we could put it in. Whatever we want, we can put it in, right? So let's say that's it for the first button. Let's just duplicate that line. So I just did Control D, and then I want this one in the third grid, which would be grid column 2. Sorry, in the third column, which would be column with the number 2. So remember 0, 1, 2, right? And this one is going to have the same width. All right. So that's how you can start laying out your controls really. Now, what if I wanted, well, let me forego any other modifications and let's just test this out. So go ahead and run it. And while you're running it, I'm just going to walk you through what you're looking at on my screen. So one, you can see that the borders, the layout is kind of weird, and that's because of the different values that we use. So 10 was to the left, 50 from the top, 80, and then 10 below, right? So it's left, top, right, bottom. And then what we also would notice is that the buttons are in the auto columns. And then because we have that gap of 30, that's how we created that little space in between, right? So those are little design things. Those are things that maybe you would want to do differently. But the point is that once you know or have an appreciation of how the layouts work, then you can make it work the way you want it to. So you can go ahead and play around with those. You have different layouts. Like I said, you have the vertical stack layout, and you can actually get more information about the different layouts from the documentation for .NET MAUI layout. So you have the stack layout, you have the absolute layout. We looked at the grid, you have the flex layout. Flex is basically almost like if you ever use Bootstrap. I'm going to run parallels because more than likely you've been a web developer at some point and you've used Bootstrap. So with Bootstrap, you have a row and it has up to 12 column spaces. And if you exceed that, it wraps around to the next space. That's how the flex works. So you put as many elements from left to right, and then when it exceeds the amount of space, it just wraps, and it just wraps and wraps and wraps and wraps, right? So I'm sure you're just looking at these things and your brain is going crazy. And if you look to the left here, you'll see other kinds of layouts. You have the grid, you have we talked about the grid already. You have the bindable layout, you have absolute layout, you have the horizontal stack layout, and the one that we looked at, the vertical stack layout. Hey guys, welcome back. This time around, we're going to be looking at shared resources. So shared resources would be an extension of what we kind of looked at earlier with the extension, except it's not going to be so tightly coupled to any one control, right? So let us start off by adding a new class, right? Click add new class, and then I'm going to call it shared resources. Click add, and then we're making this one a static class. So this is a static class called shared resources. And then in here, we can define some public static read-only properties, right? So let us start off by saying maybe that we want a certain color, right, for our font. So static, public static read-only, and I'm going to call it, well, the type is going to be color. So color is a type, and let's call it font color. I spell color with a U, so you're always going to see me do that. And then we're going to give it a value, right? So our font color here is going to be color dot, and then we can do from int, from RGB, etc. Let's do RGB. I think that's easy enough to get by with. So if we wanted it to be, well, RGB is red, green, and blue. And we can use integers between 0 and 255. If you're familiar with CSS, that shouldn't be a foreign concept to you. So we can use something like 0, comma, 0, comma, and 25 for argument's sake. So that would give us a more blue font color, right? We can also set other values. So I could set like background color, I could set foreground color, I could set all sorts of things. I mean, once I have the data type and I give it a name and then can give it a value, it can be put in that static shared resources file. Now to use this resource or any of the resources from this file, I just need to go to a control. Let me go to the new page one. And then up here, I'm going to do something similar where I have to include the namespace, so XML NS colon, and then I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it resources. And I'm going to say you are equal to CLR hyphen namespace colon, and the namespace for my shared resources file is indeed still my first MAUI app. But of course, if it was in a folder, we're not paying attention to the folder structure is too tough here, because I could have easily put this in the resources folder. So let me actually do that. So I'm going to move that shared resources file to the resources folder. And then what I'm going to do is synchronize to the namespace so that we can make sure it's in the correct namespace. So at this point, when I'm including it in the XAML, I have to make sure that I am pointing it to the correct namespace. So we're in new page one, CLR namespace is my first MAUI app dot resources, right? So now we know where this button is. Now to make reference to it in the code, wherever I want that color to be used, let's say I want it in the label here, then I would go for the attribute that says text color is equal to, and then open my curly brace. First of all, I would say x colon static, so that it knows that, okay, I'm getting my value from a static member. So static member, let me get my spelling right. And that's equal to, and then we say resources, that's our alias for our namespace up top, resources, shared resources, which is the name of our file, and then font color. So here we're saying go and fetch the font color from this static shared resources file. So anywhere in our code that we want to share that color, we can do something like that. And we can have, once again, as many resources listed out in here that we know we want to remain consistent across the entire app. So you can go ahead and test that out. You can go ahead and run it, put it in multiple places, and just go ahead and ensure that whatever color you would have defined here is actually being displayed in those areas. All right, guys, so let's take a look at platform-specific markup. So what happens is that, remember that we have one code base, one set of pages and controls, and we have to serve multiple devices. So some devices may have certain design considerations that others don't. And MAUI makes it very easy for us to specify certain values for certain operating systems within the code, so it will contextually load or render the content according to what is declared. So let us start off with looking at how we would say on which device we want whatever margin or padding with our vertical stack layout. So for context, I'm back in the layout.xaml file. And in this file, what I'm going to do is give it a name, right? So I'm going to say x:name is equal to, and then let's just say layout v stack, or that should be v stack layout. Let me do v stack layout, right? So now that we have that name, in the code behind, I can make reference to it, right? In the layout constructor, what if I wanted to say that the vstack layout dot padding, I want this to be equal to something different if it's an iOS platform versus if it's anything else, right? So I can say device info, which is a special class given to us that allows us to specify the platform. So device info dot platform, if it is equivalent to, and then we have access to device platform, which is pretty much an enum. As soon as I see it, there we go. So device platform, we can specify for Android, iOS, Mac Catalyst, Mac OS, Tizen, etc., etc. You see all the devices here that you can actually try to facilitate, right? So let us say that for iOS, if the device platform is for the iOS, then, and I'm just going to use a ternary operator here, then we want to define new thickness, which is the object or the struct used for padding. So let me backtrack a bit. So if it is iOS, then we want new thickness, and let us say I wanted 30 by 10 by 30 by 10, etc. And then otherwise, I would want it to be just 30 all around. So I can just say, or let's just say 25 all around, right? And that's it right there. I just specified that I want the padding to be different if we're using an iOS device. That is what I want. Otherwise, for any other device, do that. So obviously, if you wanted to cater to more scenarios, you'd probably want to use an if statement or a switch statement, so that it's not a ternary operator where we're only comparing with one at a time, right? So that is how we'll do it in the code behind. Now, alternatively, in the markup, what we could do is put the attribute, so padding is equal to, and then we could superimpose our on platform right here. So we could say on platform, and then we just list out all of the potential platforms. And here we can start off with iOS once again, and we can define the values that we just used. Let me just see if I can go and grab them quickly. So we use some arbitrary values. I'm not really taking that seriously right now, but we can define them. They would have to be in single quotes because we're already inside of double quotes here. So we don't want to use single quotes to specify the iOS values and any other value. And then like we did iOS and then default. So comma, and then you'll see default as one of the options, which means that anything that's not iOS, what value do you want? I want it to be, let's say 30, right? So that is a nice way to just specify that the padding on platform iOS, that. We could also do something with like the background color, right? So I could say background color here, right? And then do the same thing on platform iOS. I want it to be, let's say, green. right? On Android, I want it to be Alice Blue, etc. So we could go on and on and on. So that is how we can do platform specific configurations in the same markup, once again, utilizing our singular code base to the max. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at setting up flyout navigation, which is a type of navigation where a window for the menu item that was selected kind of flies from the side into the center of the screen, right? And typically we would have what we call the hamburger, or those three lines to the top left or right corner of the screen. I think it's more likely you'll see it in the left, but we'll see those hamburger pills appear. When we tap it, we should be able to select which page we want to go to, and then that page will fly in. So let us take a look at what we need to do to get that up and running. So our journey starts off with our app shell.xaml. So far, we've interacted with this file whenever we wanted to change the startup page, right? So if we're focusing on the layout example, we changed it. If we were focusing on main page, we changed it, etc. So what happens is that we can actually have multiple nodes inside of this area. So I'm going to create one for each page that we have so far. So we have layout example, and I'm also going to change the title. So layout space example, and the route is layout example. We also have new page 1. And while these are not official page names, but they are there, so let's just work with them. And I don't think we have any other page. Oh yes, we have test page, right? So I have test page. And I'm really just showing you that it doesn't matter if it's the XAML page or the C# page. Each of these is an option, right? But when we run our app, we won't see anything visibly different outside of maybe displaying the one that's first in the list. So what happens is that we need to say shell.flyoutBehavior, and then we change it from disabled to fly out, right? So let us make that adjustment and test. So when our app is running, we'll see that we have our hamburger pills. When we tap that, we see it flies out. And with each title that we gave, we can see it appear. So we click layout example, there we go. If we choose new page, there we go, right? So each page that we have created so far, we can easily switch between them using this method. And that was fairly easy. I'm sure you realize that that was a very easy exercise to complete. Now, if we wanted icons on those menu items, it would be as easy as inside of the shell content, we could just say icon and then give it a path. So let us try maybe the .NET bot. I think main page had a reference to the .NET bot. I just want to make sure I get that path correctly. And well, it just has the path there. So let us try that. Let us just put the .NET bot on the main page and let us test that. And there we go. So when I put icon .NET bot, when I tap on the menu, I'm now seeing that icon. So any PNG, any resource that you add, and once again, you would add those resources here. That .NET bot is found right here in images. You can always go and add those images as you need them. And then you just add the icon to each menu item. So it gives your app a little more character and a little more, a nicer look and feel as you go along. Now, the next type of navigation that we would want to look at is tabbed navigation. Tab navigation usually originates from the bottom of the screen, and then you would have an icon per tab that you can select and see the relevant page, right? So we're still here in the shell, and what we want to do is create a tabbed page. So I'm going to open a new tag, and that one is going to be tab bar. And then inside of tab bar, we're going to have tabs. So we have the tab tag. And then inside of that tab tag, we would have that shell content, right? So let's just do a few of those. So I'm just going to create a few tabs, 3 more tabs. and then put the shell contents in each one, right? So we're just transforming from just the flyout to our tabbed navigation, right? And as you can see, it's fairly consistent. So that the syntax is not the most difficult syntax to catch on to, right? And and we already have the flyout behavior enabled. So I'm going to show you how the two of them can kind of combine to give a particular user experience. All right, so we're here in the app. If I go over to the nav bar pills, I don't see anything. If I look below, I don't see anything. However, when I click, you will notice that it is changing. So obviously there's something there, but we need a few more elements. So one, the icon wouldn't be in the shell content at that point. It would be in the tab. So the tab itself can get a title. So I could say here main page, and then I could also give this that icon. Well, I think I already have it in the clipboard. There we go. Right. So let us test that first tab. All right. So there we go. So here we have main page with the icon, right? So you could just go ahead and do that. So I don't have any other icons, or well, I'll keep the same icon for the other tabs, but I will change the label, of course. So layout, and this tab would be new page, and the final one was test page. So after making all those changes, I rerun my app, and when I take a look now, I'm seeing my tabs, right? So that's the tab navigation. Nice and easy. So now you know two ways to navigate between all the pages that you have in your app. You have the flyout menu and you have the tabbed page.